But today I'm going to talk about the ecology side. So we've had a long-term process. We've been working at this since 1991. We've been a program at the University of New Mexico since 1991, so 30 odd years now, and have worked with a lot of agencies. And you know, you can't live here and not be involved in Middle Rio Grande, right? And we've had various projects looking at monitoring vegetation change in the middle. And I'm going to talk about those today. And in the context of the Middle Rio Grande Conservation Action Plan at the end, which Yasmin and I have been working on for a number of years. So I'm going to try to tie it all together there. So let's see if I can move forward here. Get out of my way. Here we go. Found it. Okay. So that title, you know, monitoring. Let's go back to that title. That title, Status and Trends in the Albuquerque Region, Monitoring Vegetation Change in the Middle Rio Grande. I thought that was a pretty stiff title, kind of utilitarian, if you will. So I started rethinking about how I really felt about all this stuff, and it was really about taking the pulse of change in the Middle Rio Grande, isn't it? It's really, that's what monitoring is about. And, you know, monitoring from my perspective is fundamental to understanding how these river systems work, these ecosystems work, and the dynamics of a river. Monitoring has always been a second fiddle to everything else that gets done in the Middle Rio Grande. And I'm going to talk today about how I feel it ought to be first chair, okay, if you will. And, you know, because monitoring ultimately informs our management strategies for the Middle Rio Grande and restoration activities. And it needs to be good. It needs to do that information in a scientific way as best you can, so that it can have an impact on how people go about their business of restoration in the middle. And ultimately, at least from my perspective, it really builds on my sense of place about the Middle Rio Grande. Because of over the years of going out there and being there has made me really appreciate the place more than ever. I suspect there are many of you who are like that. So what is this place? We've got the largest riparian bosque in the region. If you think about all the major river systems in the Southwest, which one has a bosque like the Middle Rio Grande? None of them. I'll answer that quickly. Although it's an older stand established, in the 1940s and 50s due to regular, restoration and regulation and putting in the Jetty Jackson stuff. We created a seabed for a pretty even age standard of what we call the bosque. We've identified 240 plants through our monitoring projects that are in there. I suspect that's probably at least double or triple those in the middle itself. And 280 bird species, some 60 species of mammals, reptiles, and of course the fish, which I know nothing about. That one I won't pretend to know much about. And overall, it's one of the most diverse places, most diverse rivers in the Southwest, one that we should hopefully, and all of you do, I'm sure, appreciate. And also one that's at risk, as we're well aware of, from the issues of primarily, is the water going to be available for it? What are going to be the ecological flows to sustain our bosque? How are we going to deal with that over time? So I want to go and really focus on, for now, a big chunk of the talk today, monitoring as a fundamental to understanding the ecological dynamics of this river system. And, monitoring goes back to, how many of you knew Cliff Crawford? Okay, we know about that persona, a great persona, and he led this crew of, Cliff, Ann Culley, Rob Luster, Mark Cifuentes, Larry White, all the people from the agencies at that time to do the Middle Rio Grande Bosque Biological Management Plan, 1993. So we're heading into the 30th year since Cliff led that endeavor, and had 22 recommendations, I think, 21 or 22. Anyway, 18 and 19 was to develop a coordinated program to monitor biological quality, emphasis on diversity and abundance of native species, ecosystem integrity, and with an emphasis on restoring functional connection with the river and riparian zone of the Middle Rio Grande. So I've taken that to heart. I did my job that way. And ultimately, 19 was to develop a research program that also, based fundamentally underpinned how we look at the bosque. Now, the question of when is monitoring research and when is research monitoring is a very gray area, right? A long time we use that word monitoring because agencies don't want to pay for research. So they use the word monitoring. They never admit that, but it's true, right? Because most monitoring has to be scientific and it has to be based on some kind of structural, question that you're after. And that can't be just monitoring for monitoring's sake. Cliff took that another step further, of course, and took monitoring into the realm of the Bosque Ecosystem Monitoring Plan and the 32 schools and sites that are now invested in it, with middle schools in particular, but also, I think, a fair number of grade schools. And embedded in the BEMF is a whole monitoring program for just vegetation that's done professionally by Phil Tawney and company over the years. About every 5 years they go and reread all 31 sites. They have a very specific kind of monitoring protocol that they follow over time, and then that data is database at Bosque Ecosystem Monitoring Program. It's one of the most extensive monitoring sets that we have. And there's been other monitoring that's been done. This is Andrea Homo, who was a student of Cliff's. There's a thread here, okay. And for, where she brought to the Army Corps of Engineers, she's now in the private sector, I think, with Tetra Tech. But the idea of bringing monitoring to the restoration projects and getting the Army Corps of Engineers to be really engaged. How much they engaged, I haven't delved that deeply, but I'll try to find out, actually. So I'm sure there are a lot of other monitoring programs in the Middle Rio Grande that I'm not aware of that are going on. Most of them do, of course, with little flycatchers and rare animals, but I want to concentrate on, of course, what we've been doing. And I want to focus on these 3 projects that we've done over the years. One is the reread of the Hink and Momart transects. That's the one on the left there. And then we're going to talk about a project that was funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service under the Bosque Improvement Grant, I believe. Some big, whatever big was. And we're looking at the river, what the values of the river bars were versus the forest. And then this one, the AOP project, the long-term outcomes from natural processes restoration at the Albuquerque Overbank project, which we started in '93 with Cliff again. So we know it's changed, right? Here we are in 1930, back in Leopold's time when he was probably, boating on this kind of a river, right? And then what we get now in our current stage, which is this movement from a multi-streamed, channel system to one now that's contained by levees, mostly a single channel, and perched. It's a very different kind of river system. And of course, the discharge has declined over the years as well. And then with Cochiti Dam, major changes in how the river operates and functions. In fact, we control it. As humans control how it operates and functions. Seldomly does the nature have a say on how the Middle Rio Grande functions in terms of water. So given those major changes, how do you do restoration? How do you think about what are you monitoring? You're monitoring a very changed landscape, right? But embedded in this place, right, is this forest that we've all walked through and pieces and parts of it that are really incredible, right? So there's a modicum, a piece of that natural landscape that still we know and understand to be there. And so when we think about restoration now, we want to think about, well, what could I do to further enhance those natural processes and bring them back where I can in a very changed system. And that's what restoration in the Middle Rio Grande is about. We have this in continuous forest. We know we don't actually want a continuous forest. We want a patchwork of, vegetation types, willows and herbaceous wetlands as well as forest. And that's going to be part of what we want to talk about. Part of the changes was that this is part from the Middle Rio Grande management plan. From 35 to 89 was tremendous change, right? From mostly agricultural and to urbanization in the pink. And you'll also notice that even when you look at that strip of river, it has also been skinnied out and narrowed down as we've gone through to 86. So those changes were actually marked out as well by Hink and Omar, by Valerie Hink and Robert Omar out of ASU. And in 1984, they established 100 plus transects up and down the river between Santa Acacia and Bernalillo and Santa Acacia to look at vegetation and birds. They're most interested in bird populations, but they set up this monitoring set of 100 transects. Then William DeRegan came to me. He was working for the Army Corps of Engineers and said, he did that. Hink and Omar did that project for the Army Corps, and I have the data. Can we find out what's happened? This was probably around 1998 or so. He came to me and said, can we remeasure these places? Can we do something till we understand what changes have gone on in the Middle Rio Grande based on what Hink and Omar had done back in '84? They had also mapped, and you probably all heard about the maps. They mapped the whole place. But they'd also put these transects in. And I said, sure, why not? Do you have any money? That's always my second question. And we definitely decided we were going to go forth, and we did some work. We had to get the data, which by chance my sister-in-law was teaching over at ASU, and she went over and got it out of the herbarium out of the closet, the last of the data, and actually drove it over here for me. Okay, this is kind of rooting out the data. And in fact, today I was looking at the report, the original report, and I said, I don't know how many copies does this thing still exist, and I don't know if it's even been scanned. Right, of the report. You probably have it, Yasmin.
Yeah.
Did you scan it, by the way?
I did not.
Yes. It's only about 300 pages long. That's why no one scanned it. So that report became the foundation. The data sets, the actual handwritten data sets came to us, and we databased it all and started to look. And the structure of it, those are the sites that we chose out of here. We chose ones that hadn't been manipulated yet to analyze, ones that had not been burned, things that had not been treated. We wanted to know as best we can what were the transitions in the natural landscape that had occurred, not about any kind of treatment in this case. These transects are 2,500 feet long, okay? I don't know how, that's a lot of meters. And then at every 100 feet, they would put a bird point in, and then they would put a quadrat in that was 50 by 100, I believe, to measure the trees and shrubs in it. And they also did grass cover and other sorts of stuff, as well as do the bird counts. And that was our template to go back and remeasure. Get out there with a team of 3 to 4 people and go walk those lines. So what was the outcome? Well, here's the tree density. Tree density declined as we might have expected between 1982 and 2006 and 2016. We had to do 2 sets of measurements. We got paid in 2006 to do something. 2016 paid some more, right? Funding in my career has been, shall we say, incremental. Okay, so the trees. So after 25 years, we can see a direct decline, right, of cottonwoods going down over those 25 in both cases, both for the 26 and 2016 data, as well as among the saplings. So we're seeing this clear decline in the number of trees that were along these 25 transects. Same goes to tree willow. What we're talking about here is Salix miglioides or Salix goodingii, really. I always feel it's mostly Salix goodingii. Tree willow, and its declines between 1982 and 2016. So cheerful, right? But that's the nature of the game. And when we look at the mesec shrubs, sort of a similar pattern, some indication, of drying out. Here's 1982, and here's 2016. There's drying out. Seems to be we're losing our mesec shrubs, Salix, privet, Mulberry, these sorts of things that are leaving the system. And Russian olive seems to be quite happy. And then, and nice berries, smells nice. Anyway, it did well. It was increasing as the trees were increasing. And so the same thing with salt cedar, right? So we've had an increase of salt cedar over the same period of time, particularly in the seedling category. Dramatic changes just in that period from 1986 to now. So if you look at it over the long term, we can see the rates here. I'm saying the rates varied from about 20 to 40% per transect of loss over that period. Okay, so that's 5 to 10% per decade that we're losing to the trees. And that's not a whole lot in the life of our lives, right? You could go day to day, year to year, not notice a 1% loss of trees or 2% loss of trees. You bike down the bosque, right? You could go a long time. If you were a career biologist in the USGS, you could go a long time. And by the time you got to 20 years out, you say, oh yeah, I lost 20% of the trees. But to you, might on that morning, your coffee, that would just be the new normal. So it's this long decline that's happening, which is what generated the title, because Howe and Knopp predicted this back in 1991, that because the trees, there's no reproduction going on with the trees. There's nothing going on. It's dynamic in the system. These trees, this forest is going to die. And the Hink and Omar data suggests that is the case unless we do something. Once again, monitoring matters. That was, of course, going to be my story the whole time. Okay, to know this. And this chart is just saying, hey, if I just lost 20% over time, that's where we would end up. So in 50 years, we'd lose about 50%. If it accelerates because as they get older, their death rates are going to increase. You can do that. If on some sites might be 40% at a constant rate, but by the end of the century, we don't have much of a forest here. I don't care. I'm not going to be here. So that is to that imminent decline and this revisit that we're going to turn into a paper for the 35 years of monitoring change. So revisit the decline. So keeping that in mind, what do we do? Well, I'll get there with the Albuquerque Overbank project, but first I want to move into that middle project, which was to just look at biodiversity on the islands and in the forests. Now, at the time that we started this thing up, which my dates are 2004 on that report, right around the beginning of the aughts, people weren't thinking much about the islands, weren't thinking much about the sidebars. Certainly the Army Corps of Engineers, and particularly the Bureau of Reclamation, was thinking, we need to mow them down, right? This wasn't part of their consideration that these had biological diversity values. So I thought, well, there's a pretty dynamic spaces. Let's see what's there. So we established, at the behest of the Fish and Wildlife Service, 18 monitoring plots up and down the river, 6 of them in willow stands, 6 in Russian olive stands, and 6 kind of Russian olive mixed willow, really, and 6 in mature forests. And then we set up this monitoring grid with, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's what I was afraid of. So it's 3 times 8, 32. 6, 8? Yeah. 24. Thank you. It's late in the day. And so we set those up, and we also put pitfall plots in for catching insects, and we also did aerial plankton, but we're not going to talk about this tonight. I'm just going to talk about the vegetation component, what we found. So looking at once again, on these graphs on the left, you have willow and as the solid line mixed as the dashed line, and bosque itself as the dotted line. So if we look at the trees and shrubs, we expect a lot of trees in the tree area, right in the forest up here. And then as you come down, here's the willow and the mixed, all of the, the trees and shrubs are about the same, which we expected. They have sort of the same density, whether you're in a willow stand or you're in a Russian olive stand. And then when you look at your graminoids, the forest is like barren. It's like there's no grass a lot of times. So, I mean, there are open spaces in the forest, right, where the grasses come out and they're kind of these salt meadows. But in the forest itself, pretty depauperate from a grass point of view, and even herbaceous period. And that's evident down here. And out in the Russian olive, there's a lot more grass. There's more open canopy in some respects, and then in our willow stands is sort of in between in terms of graminoid cover, grass cover. And then forbs are most abundant on those wet river bars systems, less abundant in the Russian olive, and hardly there at all in the forest. So there's a big difference between being out on a bar, whether it's Russian olive dominated or whether it's willow dominated, and being in the forest. It's suggesting that the component, the biggest piece of biodiversity might be in those very dynamic spaces of the river bars and the edges of the river where they're wetted and they get flooded. This one we just looked at it from in terms of trees and shrubs over the whole period. And and this is the bosque, was mostly native with an exotic understory for the trees, and then mixes obviously got exotic shrubs and some willow, and obviously the willow's that way. So this is pretty straightforward, but once again, that grass picture comes through, and it's grass native for the most part in the mix, and grass native in the willow, which I thought was interesting. I always think about it mostly being exotic grasses that dominate our riparian zones, right? From agrostis on up, right? Poa pratensis, however you might think about Poa pratensis. So for me, the biggest take-home story with this project for me was looking just at species richness among the plants. So here's the cumulative layer, the number of species over time as we measured it with 1998, 1989, 2003, 2001, and 2002. So we got that 5-year period in which we were monitoring down there. And this is the number of species that we captured cumulatively along the line. So in the willows, almost twice the number of species, and that species was tapering off by the end of the season of our monitoring period, but still slightly rising. And we kept on picking up new species as well in the mixed, and very few in the bosque. That same pattern where the willow bars had the highest richness, particularly among forbs and grasses in the system. So it's like the take home there is that the bars are, in fact, the most dynamic and diverse pieces of this riverscape. And birds like it too. So I'm going to go to that third project, the Albuquerque Overbank project, which was started by Cliff Crawford and Nancy Umbright. Yasmin, do you remember the date? What did I say? I think it's late 90s. Late 90s. It's 1998. I think but I've got that. Yeah, 1998, 1999. And Nancy was with the Bureau of Reclamation, and Cliff, being Cliff, they got together and said, well, what are we going to do about this? Right? What can we do about reinvigorating, the ecosystem of the Middle Rio Grande? And at that time, there was not a lot of restoration going on in any big way. People were cutting down Russian olives, cutting down salt cedar, but leaving the sites alone. So they became basically weed patches once you did that. They did not have an expression of what we were seeing on those river bars, right? Of all that diversity happens in a wet place that's mostly willow dominated. It just wasn't there. So the idea was to go in and do something about that. So the sites down south of Bridge Street along the river here on the right side, on the west side. And this is what happened. So Nancy thought of this idea in September, and by the midwinter, she had gotten the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Mexico Environment Department, the Fish and Wildlife Service. You can't remember anybody else, and us at UNM on board. 4 months. She brought all the agencies on board in 4 months. So this deserves to be written up in its own right, that somebody could actually do it, because that would never happen today. Like, you know, they said, I've got this idea, and of course I just saw her the other day, she's still a dynamo. She's retired now, but she's still a dynamo. And she said to me, hey, can we go down to AOP some summer? And I said, yes, sometime we'll make that happen. And so we're gonna go do that. So this is what we did in the winter of I didn't do it, I watched it, was go, here we have this Russian olive stand on that point bar. And this is a snag, keep the snag in your mind for a little while. And then boom, they just pulled and root prowled and pulled everything out, just dragged it out. This is restoration as if this is a major flood. Think of it as a major flood that would wash this stuff out. If it could, because Russian olive is a pretty hardy beast. Takes a lot of, takes a lot to move it. But it's still no challenge for a bulldozer. So this is bulldozer restoration. And we cleared off, make the scene, make channels to kind of mimic channels where flooding could happen, and set up to go. And set it up so you can see, ultimately there was this high terrace where nothing was, it was just mowed down and the stuff was pulled out and taken away. Then the bar was lowered. It was literally plowed, and bulldozers moved all that bar stuff down to this area we call the bar fill. They just moved it in there because they couldn't, quote, really put it in the river. They just pushed it downriver. And this new bar area is something that I'll talk about. It came later. So this is the structure of the site. And I said, well, we should put a monitoring grid in. So, okay, so we put in 153 fiberglass stakes into the ground on 12.5 by 12.5 meter points. And I to this day don't know why I chose 12.5. And you'll notice that they are oriented north to south. When you're on a river bar, this is north. Right? So whenever you're down in AOP, you're always lost. You don't know which way is north. You don't know where your stakes are. So I have learned something. You don't necessarily have to follow cardinal directions when you're monitoring, because you have trouble finding stuff again. But we put them in 125, and we also have 1 meter quadrants in the corner for doing herbaceous species counts, and then the big 12 by 12s are for county shrubs and trees. And we reread them in 99 through 2002, again in 2007, and finally again in 2013. So we went 1, 2, 3, 4 years, blocked it out by another 5, went out another 5 before we settled in. So that's 16 years from ground zero of bare ground. So it happened, it wouldn't happen this year, but it happened in 1998 and 1999 that there was over 300 CFS, the 400 CFS that flooded in the spring of both years. We actually got water that simulated a flood. So the luck of being able to bring all the agencies together, bring all that all that equipment down there, get it all done, and then get exactly what you ordered, a flood, for a natural process kind of restoration, which is what we were after. How do you use the river? How do you use the sediments that are available to you? How do you use what the river does with its water to drive restoration in the middle Rio Grande? And then by 1999, we had 10,000 seedlings, maybe more. They just boomed with that flood. And we, here in 2003, we had this really rich scape of forb rich, tree rich, everything you would like. And if we look at the numbers, a little bit of other stuff. So here's that idea of 10,000 cottonwoods and what they do. In 1999, well, we had a steep drop off, just from thinning all those guys. You couldn't walk through them. There's so many. It self-thinned out through 2003. And we came back in 2007, there were still quite a few. So on that site, which is about 5 acres, something like that, I'm not sure. There were still 2,500 trees. There's still a lot of trees down there, although they're dwindling in some ways. And where they grew mattered. So remember that high bar that it was not mowed down. Well, here's our Russian olive actually started coming back on it. It declined again because Nancy said, well, we can't let it take over again. We're going to treat it. So we retreated Russian olive in here by just cutting it down. And the native, there were some trees, but not a whole lot. They didn't really go anywhere. On the lower bar, that's where we had a huge amount of trees, 16,000. And they've self-thinned, but they maintained all the way out to become young trees that they are now in this year 2013. And then on the bar fill, that place where we took all that material and pushed it, took off and just dropped it like you would drop it, as a borrow pit, just pushed it in. That place was not as productive and didn't generate nearly as much reproduction as the other sites, which points to that the way rivers lay down sediment is different from how you might lay down sediment. And it's really hard to replicate if you don't have a flood. It was one of those, I think, I'm hoping you'll comment on that, Yasmin, when I get done. But, the cottonwood was primarily, in the channels and in the lower bar area, as I mentioned. There were Russian olives that were scattered around and they were treated here and there. There's still a lot out there, and the treatment, the Bureau has said they would treat, but there hasn't been a lot of treatment going on as late. And here's that bar fill area, right? But still nothing goes on, even 20 years later. And the species richness, back to that idea of species richness and how it works on the river bars. Oh, I got a new fresh river bar of its own now, right? And so that the cumulative species richness of all grasses and forbs just kept crawling up over the years as we go from 01 to 2013. And the gray area is the exotics. The dark ones are the natives. And you can see that the number of species that are native still is above those that are, in fact, non-native. And this is the wet bar. This is the, if I get it right, this is the bar fill, and this is the high bar. So that wet area, that wet place that was lowered closer to the water table, very rich and dynamic. And this is sort of the average over time. So that on any given year, there was a lot of species richness on those wetter sites. And in terms of cover, it's sort of the same pattern, right? We have higher cover on the low bar through time, then the high bar, and then the fill site for both shrubs and for grasses. And the exotics are playing games on the high bar a little bit, but not much right here in the forbs. But it's the same story for cover. So remember that snag? I pointed out, well, it was here when they cleared it out. It got pushed by the river down here. And around 2003, this bar started forming behind it. The new bar started forming behind it. And that's what the new bar looked like in 2013. So this says large woody debris matters, and we don't have a lot of it in Middle Rio Grande. Who knows the origin of that snag, but we know that snag is still there, but no one can find it because it's now really buried. I know it's there. Every time I go down, I keep looking for it. I'm going to find it. And in the process of that new bar, we had a lot of graminoid cover on it, but by 2005, that dwindled out to 2003, but the trees take hold, and trees and shrubs took over the site. So once there's other ways in which the bars form and how you can if you think about large woody debris and how you can use it in a system for restoration, you get, once again, another dynamic system. You're activating the dynamic system with large woody debris. The other piece of it were beavers. How many of you have actually walked along the river channel and counted the number of beaver trails? Fair number, huh? Like every 50 feet? Seems that way. Probably not that many, but it seems that way. There are a lot of beaver in the middle of Rio Grande, and a lot more since Fish and Game has stopped trapping them and moving them out. So they had their impacts. And so you can see here, you know, from our monitoring counts, you know, they'll eat a little bit of Russian olive, you know, they certainly will eat a lot of cottonwood. Half of their cottonwoods are getting chewed on and dropped. This is that new forest I was talking about just now and what's happening to it with beavers. So one could say, well, I hate beavers. And some people do. But they're part of the system. There may be some needs for control or ways you protect trees. But we don't really know is how many trees it actually takes to build a forest. If I started off with 10,000 in a restoration project, and I'm still at 2,000, right, trees on that site, how many can I sacrifice to beavers and still get a forest? And I don't know that answer. Need to monitor this more. But it's not going to be me. And the other surprise, I mean, we're bopping along in 2007 and saying, this is one great, beautiful site. Fantastic. It's a little Eden, right? We were marching out there, middle Eden. It's just wonderful, great diversity. And then we come back in 2013 and measure again. And what do we see? We see Ravenna grass come on, gangbusters. It just starts coming on in 2013. Here's our non-native grass species. And then boom, 2013, we had this Ravenna grass cover. And as you all know, I'm sure, it's just springboarded across the whole middle Rio Grande. Coming out of the zoo is my understanding, with unintended consequences, right, of what would be known if you release this into the wild. It's there. I don't know what to do about it, but it is a major tussock grass that occupies the site and holds the site. And something it's quite beautiful. So there's an aesthetic thing here that for everyone who, I think all of you in here are scientists. So there's this, yeah, I love the aesthetics of it, but I also love the science of it. And I can differentiate this piece. But Ravenna grass is definitely part of the evil empire. In my book. Okay, so we were able to reestablish an ecosystem with patch diversity and a lot of structure and composition and functionality that the AOP represents. And we essentially rejuvenated a forest on site through natural regeneration using the power of the river, the sediments, etc. And you know, the outcome suggests that as I read my stuff there, that AOP can be a useful model for large river riparian ecosystem restoration, where you use bar lowering and other kind of techniques in flooding, and to generate a system where you're really trying to do low intensity management. So when Nancy would say, I got to go get those Russian olives, she's talking about low intensity management, really. It's not the same to go get 5 or 6 Russian olives in a given year or every 5 years as to have to bring the bulldozers out again. It's a different scale of how you do management in the system, how you do your cultivation, if you will. So having talked a lot about the monitoring, you know, monitoring then informs management and restoration activities. And I've been trying to sort of allude to that all along. And then, you know, how does that get done? So I published this paper. I published the paper on AOP for a specific reason. I published it in Ecological Restoration, which is the sister journal to Restoration Ecology. And that's fine. I get a brownie point. If I go look in who's read it, I don't know, 10 people who are academics. But I use these people just to be able, I can talk to you about it. It was really important for me to publish this paper to talk about the Middle Rio Grande itself and to talk to everyone like yourselves about it and communicate this and say, okay, this peer reviewed, try to believe me when I'm talking about these things. And that's how that part of that communication piece that happens when you want to move this to the place of management. And it's happening. A lot of things have happened since we started that ALP project. You know, I'm sure it's embedded in a lot of plans. I know it's embedded in what the Army Corps of Engineers is doing, maybe because Vangia has been there over the years. It's there. It's embedded in what Yasmin does for Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District. All this stuff has informed that. I'm not saying that I was the king of the pile here. I'm just saying it was important for me to get my contribution to make sure that story got told. And that led us, Yasmin, Adrian Oglesby from the Transboundary Resource Center, and a couple of my colleagues from Colorado Heritage Program, and Elizabeth Milford, who, by the way, is our riparian ecologist for the last 25, 30 years in the program, to start up this, well, it was really Adrian drove it initially, to develop the Middle Rio Grande Conservation Action Plan. How many of you have heard of this? We got work to do. It's in development. It's on its first version. We didn't widely. We developed it out of a series of workshops with scientists, and we've gone to a second phase now of a series of workshops, and we expect to publish this thing hopefully by the end of the year. And it's driven by the ideas that come out of this kind of restoration of natural processes, restoration and developing very dynamic patch mosaics in the riverscape, similar to the dynamic and patchiness that we developed at Albuquerque Overbank, or the patchiness that river bars provide to a system, as opposed to just a uniform forest. How do we make a dynamic, really living forest? We need a plan for that. And I fell back on the work of Mary Palmer, and she this great article about what are the 5 commandments for doing successful restoration, you know, ecological commandments. Well, one of them is to have a guiding image, right? And we have in our group this image that we then translated to the people in the workshops about wanting to have, you know, a really dynamic river system. So I think we had an image, and I think there were a lot of people that agreed with that in the room about this is where we wanted to go. And then you do that, you want to make sure that whatever you do, you can actually measure it, that you improve the system and that you increase resilience in the system. Part of what we were after here was, if you bring a patch dynamics into the system and talk about patch structure, then can you break up fire dynamics and build resilience so that you don't have large bosky fires by building a patchy structure? And then in the end, you know, with any monitoring, I mean, restoration project, you don't want to do any harm. Now, it's not like the fires, right, where harm was done through restoration, irreparable harm. I'm not sure what it would be in a riparian situation. You could do things like reintroduce, incidentally, another Ravenna grass into the world. You could do things that may or may not be valuable. So you have to be really cognizant of that when we do restoration. I found out that last one, ecological assessment, has been completed. You got to monitor yourself to know whether or not you were successful. So we have that site. We want moving the river towards the least degraded, most ecologically dynamic state possible, given its regional context, given the water that we have available, given the sediments that we have available in the system. And we, you know, and taking advantage of our reference sites, like here's the Gila, right? Here's a wild river. What goes on in a wild river, and how can we emulate stuff that's going on in the wild river in a very controlled system? Do a lot of analytical work, build some models of how we're going to get from here to there, and then have a dedicated constituency. I think we in the agency, we have that. I suspect we have it in this room to a certain degree, of people who would really like to see this happen. And that's what the CAP is about. And we're really working around that idea of a dynamic patch mosaic of what we created in AOP and spreading it up and down the river. In terms of what it might look like, this is just a cartoon of, you can think of this as all the cottonwoods, even gauge stands that we have on the river with a little bit of patchiness, a little bit of river bar, that we want to get to this. And that's a big ask to this really structured patches, high structural diversity as well as high patch diversity. That's the goal. And so in the plan, the conservation action plan, we kind of build everything around this dynamic patch mosaic framework, and then we organized our working groups around riparian, wetland, and vegetation communities, native birds, fish, wildlife corridors, ditch and drain, because out there in the agricultural landscapes, there's really important value for wildlife and diversity on its own in and around the drains, the ditches. Wanted not to forget that. And you will notice that it isn't about willow flycatcher, it's not about cuckoo, and it's not about a particular fish that won't be named. Right? It's about an ecosystem. And that's really core to what the plan is about. Kind of changing our focus away from just species-oriented management of the system. And that's where that question of irreparable harm can happen. You have to be very careful if you're just going to be species-oriented in restoration, because it may not do well for every species. So this was just the example of the things that we're going through to talk about with our riparian and wetland vegetation communities. We sort of had this landscape context about what you need in the hydrological regime to maintain the system. We want to know about, we assess, what the abundance was of woodland, shrubland, and meadow and marsh. We want like equal amounts of that stuff. And we said, well, we're kind of in the fair zone right now. We want to get very good on that. And we got upland vegetation encroachment with elms, right? You name it, even junipers. I mean, they're not exotic, but it's representing the dry system. You want to go from a fair to a very good, and you want that mixed age class of cottonwoods, because that's telling you how dynamic your system is. They're all the same age and they're all old. You don't want to be there. And we feel that that's where we're poor right now. And that's where our restoration has to say, I need a bunch of young places, young stands, and river bars. And of course, you want to get rid of, as much as possible, your exotic woody cover. As I showed in those graphs, Russian olive is fine, but it's in the middle road, isn't it, between having a willow stand and having a forest. The willow stand still stands out as more biologically diverse. I don't know about the aggressive invasive herbaceous species. If anybody's got any ideas, I'd love to hear them. So in all of that, the whole thing is about that ecological assessment is completed. And I really want to drive home this where monitoring is so important. And that's where we really need to build that into the conservation action plan and make sure it's there when we go towards implementation, which is where we're heading. So we have our group of scientists that have put this together. Now we want a group of managers to come together and talk about how do we implement it. And that'll be the second version of the Middle Rio Grande Conservation Action. So that vision that was in the vision statement for this thing is that working together towards a healthy Rio Grande ecosystem will not only provide for sustainable fish and wildlife habitat, but also lead to enhanced water quality and availability, lowered fire hazards because that patch structure is all diversified out, improved recreational opportunities because it's going to be a more interesting place. And this, with that comes economic vitality when you do this stuff. And a collective sense of stewardship and pride about this, what is a truly world-class place that we live in. We all know that. We're all New Mexicans. We all know why we're here. It ain't the money. Okay. And so that comes back to that third element. Having done all this work for myself, and I think a lot of you who have learned, hopefully I've been able to give you a little bit more information than you knew before that would kind of build on your sense of place about what the Middle Rio Grande is about. And that's what I have to say. I wanted to talk about, if we could open up the discussion, I really want to talk about what to do going forward. Do we keep doing monitoring? How do we do monitoring in scientific efforts? Are there citizen science initiatives that we should try to think about? What kind of collaborations can you, all of you in this room, do with all of us at UNM? So with that, I'll open it up.
About your model, I don't mind. There's nothing in the model about fire. I mean, we've had a couple of big fires in the Rio Grande area. Bosque. Yeah, but recently we've had one, right? And so, I mean, I didn't.
Yeah, fire is one of those things, I don't ignore it. By introducing a patch mosaic, it implies, and in the CAP we talk about that, it implies that you can introduce fire breaks to prevent catastrophic fire by really fine-tuning that mosaic. And that's kind of the game. You really got to know what you're doing to get that right, and work with your fire managers to get that right. So they need to be part of the process of planning that and figuring that out. They have to be integrated into the concept. Oh yes, I'm not just going to put in my next dozer line here, whatever it might be, whatever happens in fire planning. No fire in the Bosque, from my opinion, is anything but human caused.
I know it doesn't. Well, they happened. I mean,
so it's a managing question, a managing a people question, and then how do I respond to the people who do these things? So did that kind of get out where I'm at with fire? And it's in the plan, but it wasn't something I directly studied.
right.
Oh, wait a second, Yasmin, we did do the post-fire stuff, didn't we? Down at Berlin?
Yeah, a project, a restoration project in the burned area.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just say, kind of to SB's points about the dynamic that, the design is to, I would say, diversify the biology, ecology, plant life, to not have just a linear strip of forest, which is not natural itself. That was really created by efforts at flood control. It's not the way the Bosque used to look. But also, looking forward with the reality of climate change and, predictions of having potentially 25% less water, in a matter of decades, then what's the Bosque going to look like? What can it actually support? It's not going to support riparian species in its entirety anymore, most likely. I don't think we're going to be able to do that. We'll do it where we can. And, where we can't, we have the opportunity to create grasslands, still breaks, more drought resilient, types of vegetation that will be more resilient in drier, hotter conditions. So, these are all things that we're talking about. We have to, think very seriously about it. What does that plant palette look like? And I think that's where some of the folks here with the Plant Society have a role to play in helping to inform that, because we want native plants, right? We might want to bring in exotics, but just the same question they're going to have to ask in the forest now that it's burned, right? Well, are you going to have a ponderosa pine forest there anymore in 10 or 20 years? Maybe not. Right? Is it going to grow back? Maybe probably not. So what could grow back there that will have a chance of surviving and creating some kind of habitat?
With a caveat to that. But what you're speaking to is definitely the question of transformational work that you do for ecosystems, moving from one state to another with the resources that it has. There's a component of what humans are willing to provide to that system, because of course it is a regulated system. And in fact, how much water and how much sediment you put in the system is in fact our choice. It's not a natural choice. So transformational work is in the cards, there's no doubt about it. But I always think of it as that's my last step, I always look for building resilience and resistance in intermediate ways to try to maintain the system as much as possible. There are those that say, well, just let it be elms. And I'm not there yet.
Let it be what, elm?
Elms.
We have a lot of invasive elms now all over the place.
Oh, I know, but if Albuquerque didn't have elms, it wouldn't have trees. Okay, right? I mean, I live in an elm woodland down in the North Valley. I love my elm trees, but they have their particular place in an urban landscape, but not inside the levees, nor tree of heaven, or mulberry.
Right, mulberries are another. I mean, I have a yard full of invasive mulberries.
Invasive mulberries. Well, we call them what they are is cultivars. Of course, elms are incredibly prolific. What a successful species.
It is.
You're not going to get rid of this baby. This guy, this lady, whatever, generates, as we all know, so much seed that it's going to make it one way or the other. Makes it on my roof. Okay, I have to go up and make sure I clean them out on the roof because they root up there.
But as far as the beavers,
Yeah.
Colorado, they actually trap the beavers and sterilize them to cut down. Otherwise, there would be too many. They come right up into the Platte River and they.
I don't know much about the beaver management now in the middle of Rio Grande, so I really can't address that question.
Yeah.
I know that for at least for a while, game fish pulled out because the trap's got a dog. Okay, and that just everybody was up in an uproar. So game fish just threw up their hands. So okay, well, we won't put traps in. I don't know if that's held or not, but my sense is that they haven't been back to pull the animals or to sterilize them or to do anything to control those populations that are in the middle.
I don't know where the money comes from to do it, but that is part of what the management is. Otherwise, the city of Denver, all the trees would be chopped down.
Yes, Barbara.
What we noticed is porcupines.
Yeah.
They seem to be worse than the beavers as far as they strip so much stuff when you walk through certain areas. It's just.
Well, and I had a porcupine in my yard in the Northeast Heights. So it's like the coyote and everything else.
In certain areas, you don't have to know.
I really can't speak to them. Sorry, I don't know much
He
about
wants
what they're
to
doing
take
there.
it out.
I know there are a lot of them. I see them. I've never thought of them as in the same way that I think about, they defoliate, but it's not the same as cutting down the tree.
But it kills the saplings aren't going to grow, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Because that's that question. Well, how many saplings do you need? And then if you have a natural system, at least a quasi-natural system that you're working with, and you got your water table down a certain area, and what is your expectation of how many mature trees do I want to get, and how dense should that canopy be? Lots of things to think about when you start actually building restoration types. It's back to the idea of transformation. How many trees, and then how many trees can place support maybe with water? If cottonwoods, maybe it's this question of how many per hectare do you have that you can actually support with the water that you have? So that's that in between place I'm always looking for. That is before you get to having to accept. Well, I don't mind, saltgrass meadows with sporobolus and whatever. They're part of that patch. Mosaic, they're really part of it, and they've always been that part. I'd like to have a lot more, for sure. I'd like to have a lot more marsh. Back to that 1930s photograph, it'd be that's really the hardest piece. And then the cap, we're saying, hey, if we could get to 10% marsh, we'd be doing great. It's not going to be 90% like it was in that photo, but it's what more than it is now. I'm a middle of the road guy. Anyway, yes.
In what way do you use volunteers in your monitoring and restoration?
It's been limited. We have students, and we have student technicians, and they have, essentially they're under an internship with us. And I've used my daughter, much to her chagrin. She's never forgiven me. I'd like to enhance that piece. I mean, part of what I put this in the last slide was, what are the kind of, volunteer activities we could do here? I'm telling you right now that we've got these monitoring sites and they haven't been tested in a while. So, there's a volunteer activity right there for you who are the experts who could go out there, and I asked Elizabeth just last week, Elizabeth, could we find those bar sites again? And she says, yeah, I think we could. If someone hasn't pulled the rebar, so that's an opportunity there, because that was the Fish and Wildlife Project. I don't see Fish and Wildlife going there again to support it, but we could find some small pots of money to try to get it done. And with combination with folks like yourselves or anyone else you can think of that could be involved in that. It's, Bosque Elms doesn't try to go there. They just pay people to read the transects, right? I think there's some kind of middle ground there where we could get people to volunteer, but give them, an honorarium to do it, right? Give them something and find somebody just to sort of at a low speed. It's wonderful to get out there and do it. Despite what my daughter said.
Are you using chemicals to get rid of some of the plants, or do you keep to natural means?
I'm out of that realm, so I don't do the direct management on these sites. It's really up to Middle Rio Grande and Open Space and others. I don't even know what's going on really. There's some mechanical treatment still going on as well. And there is some chemical that's done on an individual stem by stem basis, but no broadcast chemical.
No, directly on the stump.
It's always directly on the stump.
No, you cut these trees, you burn them, they just come back. Right away.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Basic trees.
Hey,
It's up there.
they yanked them out.
Yes, it is.
They yanked them out on that AOP site.
Yeah.
They can't, you just leave this much root. It says, I'm fine. I'm fine. He left the root. I'm good. Yes, Lee.
You mentioned through your talk specifically about the Russian olive. Is there a dynamic between Russian olive and the salt cedar? I mean, are they the same, or do they work against each other or for each other?
I don't know about their interactions. I mean, there are a lot of mixed stands of both. I don't know much about their interactions. We didn't go, the Middle Rio Grande doesn't have a lot of salt cedar actually, per se. Most of it's in this, towards the southern reach or up in the Espanola reach, right? So we didn't have much chance to actually look at it directly. We do know that the biodiversity inside of a salt cedar stand is really, really low. Ones that I have sampled we've been sampling all over the state for 30 years. We get in there, you got 2 or 3 or 4 species, maybe another shrub. You're talking about species richness at 3 to 4 species, than the salt cedar. So it's, for me, it's definitely part of the evil empire. Unless people trying to convince me that Russian olive is okay and I shouldn't just be diametrically opposed to it, because it's providing food, particularly for birds and cover. And it does, as the data shows, it's an in-between place in terms of species richness. Okay, and maybe that's okay because it's pretty tenacious.
What's wrong with salt cedar?
It's the diversity inside the stands is just incredibly low. And then, it's transforming the soils, it's doing everything. And if you ever walked in there in the summer, there's, there are plenty of mosquitoes, but there's not much else.
Well, we get cedar fleas. Smell. I call them cedar fleas.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's beautiful, right?
No, they're horrible. And they hang out near those trees.
Oh, okay.
And they'll bite your eyelids.
Oh, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
No-see-ums,
It really
basically.
depends
There's
on,
plenty of no-see-ums in the.
talking about this monotypic stand, the salt cedar, are you talking about a mix? Some of the mixed stands where you have cottonwood, when you have willows underneath it, and salt cedar and Russian olive and other things,
Yeah, so
can provide pretty good bird habitat.
Yeah.
The Russian olives are there along with trees and stuff like that, but it's, again, it's balance, it's an invasive plant, and if you don't manage it, it's just gonna become more
more
What's the
invasive.
long-term
So-
trajectory of that species balance between those native and non-natives 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now?
Yeah, and I think we can,
That's the question.
we can assume as the conditions become less favorable for the native species, you know, the ones that are surviving that will probably thrive in the future, we see already are like the Siberian elms, the Russian elms, the salt cedar, locust, things like that. And, you know, they're trees, they don't provide, you know, the kind of riparian aggregate wetland habitat that some species need. You know.
So, you know, they're in this mixed zone of stuff and they, you know, and how they operate. And I don't know what the long-term trajectory of those, all of that is in terms of when you have mixed stands and where they're really going, because we didn't test that. It brought up another idea though, about the question of things to do. We have in our database close to 20,000 vegetation plots. This harks all the way back to my days with Rudy Becking, who whenever he collected a plant, he insisted that we do a plot. So we have all these plots that we've been collecting since the early 90s. And I've started a project with shoestring projects to go back to those plots, wherever they might be, and reread them. When we had these sort of standard plots in which they're 40 by 40, and we capture every single species in the 40 by 40. And then we have releves where we capture every species that's in the stand. So I want to go back and revisit a bunch more of these. And I wanted to ask folks like yourself, if I gave you a plot in the Jemez Mountains to go visit on a Sunday, would you like to go do that? You don't count, Yasmin. I think that, sorry.
We're not allowed.
I was just wondering about if there's any studies that have looked at companion planting and adding plants to the areas that we have that don't have companions. And what that might look like or what had, because, you know, companion planting could be an ideal theory.
Well, we have a lot of plot data that tells about what the plant associations are for these sites. And so you could think of it in the restoration context, that's what do I need to build out that might have been driven out by salt cedar or whatnot. What do I need to bring back into that space that's part of the association? And that's as close as I can get for that, as opposed to you really want to understand what the complex was, what the association was, what those species were, and say, oh yeah, we should bring in so-and-so, but it's got to fight off across the stolonifera, and it's got to fight off all these other exotics again too, but the more you bring into that. I mean, you saw in my graphs that in those willow stands, they were still dominated by natives. You know, and then the exotics are having trouble actually pushing in, except for Ravenna. So I don't have the direct answer for you about companion planting, except that we kind of know what the complex of species that should be there. And then you can say, oh, what's missing? And do I need to seed bank that and bring it back in? Is that kind of along the lines?
It's a good question.
Yeah, Lee.
You mentioned ditch and drain habitat. Does it matter that MAFCA mows everything down, or is there any, what is the impact of MAFCA's ditch and drain maintenance in terms of the natural?
I don't know about a MAFCA. From Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, in terms of how they're managing the drains, Yasmin can address this. We're talking about it right now. In that Rio Grande cap, we're asking what are the values of ditch and drain habitat, and what can we do to modify MRGCT management of how to preserve at least portions of those drains and build diversity into the ditch and drain habitat that wasn't there before. Wouldn't you say that's kind of way stating it correctly, Yasmin?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, what can we entertain and possibly add or change the management of to provide some of the values that not just the public's looking for, but that, you know, as an agency, we're looking for that would actually lessen our need to be here and do maintenance, lessen our need to use anything like herbicides, lessen our need to do mowing, because we have a good perennial grass cover on ditches, trees in the outer right of this, for shade, people walking, for birds. So it's acknowledging that these places are never gonna have biological diversity in a place like the Bosque, but they can be important connectors between a larger ecosystem like the Bosque and say open space areas. That managed as agricultural or natural areas. That's, I think, we acknowledge that most of the trees on ditches now are exotic. That's probably the way it's gonna be, especially with less water. But, it's still something aesthetic, that's there that we can make, that we can manage for. But, the more vegetation cover we have that works for our maintenance and management, the less erosion we have, the less water quality issues we have, the less weeds we have, the less we have to, use herbicides, which we cut way back on, that kind of stuff. I think the biggest challenge is the tree cover. When you have thousands and thousands and thousands of trees that are falling down, because of age and stress and stuff like that, it's a management challenge.
It is a man. I live 20 feet from an irrigation ditch, and it's really a nice one. So it has tree cover, and it has, on one side it's mostly got shrubs and grasses, and it's a really great habitat. I'd like to see that expanded, particularly in the urban environments where people are using it. But I have, so we have, Cooper's hawks and all sorts of things that, of course, cats and dogs too. But anyway, in the chat, someone asked, "Can yerba mansa has increased in some areas of the Bosque?" And I presume that's true, but we always sort of think of yerba mansa as a desirable, at least from my perspective. It's an indicator of that wetness that's happening in the system. So wherever it's an indicator of, to me, of a proper functioning condition, actually. And I don't know what it means. I'm not familiar with how it's increasing, but that's all I can say is.
Interesting to me is, people think of yerba mansa as really being that sort of semi-shaded, high water table, which it kind of does, but, we found yerba mansa just exploded in areas where we had fires that had tight clay soils, saline soils, and even out there in the blazing sun, it survived for years. So I think it's more resilient than people think sometimes.
I think if the water table's there, I think it can take the sun.
Well, you other two questions that are in the chat. Right?
Yeah, I'm going to get there. Tree of heaven really invasive in the Bosque. Can they be removed before they get larger and denser? Well, we would hope so. Oh, another nasty gram, right? It doesn't seem to ever go away. And I don't really know much. I'm not really a person on, I'm not a restoration specialist. So it's hard for me to answer those questions about it. I mean, it's up and down my ditch. People just keep hacking it away. I don't know much about its control. It's one of those things along with elms and mulberries. And when we see it in the Bosque, I think we really want to think about kneeling it however we can. Tree of heaven, which is, thank you. I knew I was in the right group.
Tree from hell.
Tree from hell. A tree from hell instead of tree of heaven. This very pernicious species. The other one is, can goats be used to help remove invasive plants and brush in some areas of the Bosque? I think that was something that was used early on when, what's his name was here, he brought goats in to as a sort of a model, so they could get them to eat the right stuff. And did the goats eat the right stuff?
I think they have application, but like any tool, there's a place where it works best, and it's effective, and then there are situations where they're not effective or they can be destructive.
Yep.
You really have to, think about where you're gonna use them and how. But I think the answer is. I think
Maybe.
kind of a yes, we're gonna monitor the site that we just did, which is a burn site, and see how they did, It, like anything, it's not a situation. Usually you have to bring them back to get your sprouts. And the same thing if you use a herbicide,
Yeah.
You're not gonna kill everything the first time around.
It's in that realm of being careful, in that irreparable harm place of how you use those sorts of animals. I mean, they brought camels into the Horonata in the 90s to eat creosote bush. Camels ate everything but creosote bush. Okay, it just didn't work. So, and goats. Don't get me wrong. I raised goats in a previous lifetime, but I would never let them in my garden.
What's interesting is that they strip the bark, and that's how they'll kill the exotic trees. I know they could do that to the natives too, if you let them. And then maybe some grass. The good thing is their hoof action, hooking can help with fertilization or seeding areas. They're great with kochia and weeds, and the great thing about goats is that they don't spread seed through their waste. So they have a distinct advantage over other types of animals. But the little salt cedar stems and stuff, they didn't bother with it really. It's too salty or it's too small to strip, and so they don't. You learn really what they do and what they don't do. What's that for you trying to do there?
I didn't get any answer about anybody who want to go revisit my plots on a Sunday picnic. Yeah, I mean, that's what Europeans do all the time. They go on a picnic and they do a plot. The wife and kids may not like it, or vice versa. The husband may not like it, but the plot gets done on the picnic. I've always felt that was an opportunity there for, citizen science gets overwrought, but just a thing that would be fun to do. And then we could get a collection of, I started getting a collection of, ones that are 20, 15 years old, 15 to 20 years old now, to see, and I'm analyzing right now, well, how much change have I seen in 15, 20 years, be it a desert grassland or a pinyon woodland or a riparian landscape. I got a bunch in riparian. I got a bunch. My problem is, don't have a bunch in the Sandias, for instance, but I have them in the Jemez, and I have them in all the rivers. I have them down in all the national parks, because I mapped the vegetation in all the parks. That's where I got a lot of my plots. So anyway.
You need GPS to find the plots? I mean, how?
It'd be helpful. It's either that or a crystal ball. I don't know. Yeah, they all been GPS. We GPS started in the early 90s. We've been GPSing for 30 years. So we have locations on almost every of them. It gets you within 2 to 5 meters, and that's good enough for what we're asking about major changes in land cover.
So you're talking about these 12.5 meter by 12.5 meter plots?
Now, these are more of our reconnaissance releve plots. They're 20 by 20.
Meters?
20 by 20 meters, yeah. Anyway, that's all I have for you. It's getting late.